Hello, and welcome to the FarmHouse. I'm Candace Worsbowski.
And I'm Stephanie Spiker.
I recently spoke with Florence Becot. Florence Becot is a rural sociologist at Penn State. She's also the lead for Penn State's Agricultural Safety and Health program, and she's particularly interested in studying families, especially farming families, in rural areas. Which is interesting because although Florence doesn't farm herself, she comes from a family line of farmers, and her mother was a professional childcare provider who at times cared for farm children. So you can kind of see how her family history directly influences her work. But the real reason I wanted to talk to Florence was because she and her colleagues recently published a study titled "The Source of All My Joy and All My Stress: Children and Childcare as Underappreciated Sources of Stress That Affect Farm Women." So first of all, I loved the title of that study because the source of all my joy and all my stress is a familiar refrain that I think anyone who's ever had kids can identify with. But more importantly and more relevantly to what we're doing here, this study casts a light on a common issue for women on farms and women in rural areas, and that is that they tend to take on a lot more of the invisible work or invisible burdens that wind up being stressful and take a toll on their mental health. And I think we hear about it all the time on this podcast that women are jugglers.
I feel like I've lost track of the amount of women who we've talked to about this kind of burden, not necessarily in the sense of they love their job, they love being a mom, but it is an additional burden. And it just makes me think of our episode last week with Hillary. When I talked to her, she had her youngest with her the whole time. And there was a point or two during the interview where she was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, can we pause a second?" Because he was getting a little fussy, and she would take care of him. And it was just like, this is their daily life. They're on the farm, they have their kids, They are quite literally juggling multiple things at once, from farming to apparently podcast interviews, all while literally having their kid in their arm or on their hip.
Right. And even if they don't have children, there's something else then that's, keeping them busy. So yeah, I was very excited to hear what Florence had to say on the issue. So let's give it a listen. Florence, welcome to the FarmHouse.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So I have to say I'm very excited to talk with you because you've been studying something that we've heard a lot about on this podcast, and that is the unique stresses that women in agriculture find themselves facing and how those stressors tend to affect these women's health. So you recently published a pretty fascinating study titled "The Source of All My Joy and All My Stress: Children and Childcare as Underappreciated Sources of Stress That Affect Farm Women." What were some of the findings from that study?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, I'd like to mention that I wasn't doing this work alone. A lot of the work that we do is part of teams. So I want to acknowledge my colleagues on this work, Shoshanah Inwood at The Ohio State University, and Hannah Budge, who was at The Ohio State at the time, but is back in Scotland, where she's from, helping her sister on the farm who just had a baby. So, it's when, how personal life and professional life intersect. So one of our main findings, and it really was a bit unexpected, this study started as a study on childcare and how farm parents, in particular farm women, navigate having the children around while they work on the farm, and how they manage as well around the safety aspect of having children on the farm, since it can be a dangerous environment. So as we were doing discussion groups with about 68 women a couple of winters ago, we were specifically asking about, hey, what does your day-to-day looks like? We did have a general question at the end about quality of life, but the issue of stress, of feeling overwhelmed, just kept coming up again and again in conversations. And the question about quality of life, when was, how essentially we ask, how does juggling it all makes you feel? And this is when we got a wide range of responses. In terms of the key findings, I would say that as we did 11 discussion groups, so with 68 women, in all of the group at one point or another, they discussed stress, oftentimes unprompted. In half of the discussion groups, they also talked about depression and mental illnesses, whether or not they had been diagnosed. One of the key findings as well is the major sources of stress were often connected with the children. And this is not surprising because we were specifically looking to talk with women who were raising children under the age of 18. So they could have older children. But for this project, we were really interested in how do you navigate school-age children, children who are, of different ages, toddlers, or at elementary school, high school, how do you navigate different types of childcare options, whether they're paid or unpaid? How do you navigate school, after school programs, summers? And so they really talked about how being the one who does all of these things at home, some talked
Mm-hmm.
about having help from their spouses, some talked about not having help from their spouses. Some were single parents as well. But they talked about the stresses of juggling it all. The kind of like it's always like on your mind, you have to do all these things,
Yeah.
as well as stress, as well as safety, being worried that the children could get hurt on the farm. And to us, that was really important because it's something that's we haven't heard talked about a whole lot, in particular when we talk about farm safety.
Having worked here at Lancaster Farming, I have heard some tragic stories about times where there were children injured or worse, and it's because they were right there while the farm work was being done, and at times farm work is dangerous work.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's Lancaster Farming. One of your colleagues, I think it was the first week of January, wrote the paper on a story about the three children that died in 2024 on farms.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's always interesting, so a lot of my work is about farm safety, well-being, and how do we keep everyone on the farm safe, healthy, happy. What's interesting is when we look at the recommendation connected to how do we keep children safe, it's always from the perspective of the children, which is wonderful. But as COVID was just starting in 2020, and schools were closing, childcare options were closing down as well. I did a survey to ask parents how they were navigating childcare and how they were navigating having the children on the farm more. Because for most farm families, the children on the farm at some point or another is their house. Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there's no way around it. But with COVID, they were on the farm a lot more than usual and at a different time of the year. And what's interesting is how much parents brought up, I could read in their words, how much stress and anxiety that was all creating. And that really also brought up questions around when we talk about children's safety and well-being, we rarely think about the well-being of the parents, but those things are connected. If the
Mm-hmm.
parents are stressed, if the parents are rushed, we know that's when incidents tend to happen more as we're taking shortcuts. And so really that study is also about this is raising children on the farm is wonderful. So many moms talked about how much they love having the children around. They wouldn't do it any other ways.
Right.
But at the same time, it was the challenges of doing it all oftentimes without a lot of resources. And so that was also another source of stress where they felt inappropriate. They felt that they weren't good enough. They
Right.
also felt guilty that they weren't given to their children the same upbringing that others. They talked a lot about not being able to take the kids to sports or to activities because it's too far or they don't have
Mm-hmm.
time or it costs money. And so it was interesting too how there was really the tension of we love the farm, but at the same time, it's hard. But we're also a group of folks that we're not supposed to complain. We are
Right.
rough folks. We put ourselves by the bootstraps. I mean, it's often how farmers and farm families are represented as, in
Mm-hmm.
the common stories of what the ag sector is like. And so I think too that what we chipped a bit of it too was women were opening up to things that they haven't really talked about in public or even with their families. And more often than not, because they were in these small groups, they were realizing that they were not the only one. And what was fascinating too is because of the logistics, so we were doing it all on Zoom. It was 2022, so we still had, it was tricky, and we were also focusing on different states. So because of practical reasons, we had organize the discussion groups based on when people were available, instead of grouping folks by, for example, type of commodity produced or size of the farm. So we had people who had a third of an acre, highly diversified farm in Vermont with dairy farmers, seven generation dairy farmer from Wisconsin, and then 2,000 row crop from Ohio. I mean, it was fascinating. So those are farmers, even though they're farmers, they might not interact. The conferences that they go to might be different. The circles that they might interact in or might be different too. And what they were talking to about is like, oh wait, like we're not that different.
Yeah.
So that was interesting too.
And what I think is also interesting is like, yes, like these are all farmers from different parts of agriculture, but I feel like the stories they're telling would also apply to a lot of moms outside of ag
Yes.
because I think, what mom hasn't sat there and thought, am I doing enough? I feel like I'm not. I didn't, get around to that meeting or I wasn't able to let my kid participate in that activity. So I do think it's interesting that, these women are having a chance to kind of pull together and realize that they're not alone, that
Yeah.
almost everyone faces these things. So can
Yeah.
you explain the concept then of the triple burden that farm
Mhm.
women face and how it kind of uniquely impacts their mental health?
Yeah, yeah. So the triple burden is a term that has been used in research for many, many years. I think it started being used in the 1980s, and it's a way to describe how women's carry different type of responsibilities. They carry the responsibility at the home of being the person who take care of the house. They are oftentimes the primary caregiver, so that can be for the children, that can be for their parents or for their in-laws. That can be for a family member who has a disability, for example. And then on top of that, they often work at the farm, in the case, of agriculture. And then very often too, and in particular more over the years, they often also have the job of the farm, because the job of the farm is not only important for health insurance coverage. We know that in the US, about 60% of farmers have off-farm jobs for that reason. But the off-farm job too is another source of income. And depending on what you're producing, the seasonality of what you do, the commodity prices the scale of your operation, that income might be really important. And so the triple burden is a different way of describing the different responsibilities that women have to juggle on a day-to-day. And so that's why we used it, because in research that has looked at mental health for farmers, we really never have talked a whole lot about women and how women's mental health might be different than men, how the stressors might be different. We also know that the ways in which stresses manifest themselves are different in men and in women. And we also know too that the way that we intervene on those stressors is going to be different based on what it is. And so if a stressor is connected to stress, or if it's pre or postpartum depression, we're going to treat this very differently than if it is stress connected, let's say, to the weather.
So can we dive a little more into that? Like, how do the mental health challenges of farm women differ from those that their male counterparts are facing, and how do they tend to present differently?
So you're kind of asking the million-dollar question.
Right.
It is only in the last 2, 3 years that there has really been studies that are specifically diving into women and into differences between men and women. So for many, many years, we've known about the higher rates of suicide in agriculture. We've known about, this is where it gets tricky too, but we've known about high levels of stress, in particular in times of crisis. So for example, in the 1980s, in some parts of the country, we had this very big farm crisis that led to sharp increases in suicides, high stress, high levels of depression, divorces as well. But it's only within the last 3 or 4 years that researchers have said, okay, how is that different? So Hannah Budge, or one of our colleagues on this study, joined us when we had already collected the data. But Hannah, so as I mentioned earlier, Hannah is from Scotland, from the Shetland Islands, grew up on a farm, and for her dissertation studied women in agriculture. So we were really interested in bringing on Hannah on the team. But what we found is there was a big study in the UK 2 or 3 years ago that did a pretty large survey of farmers. And they found stark differences between men and women. And in that case, they found that women were experiencing higher rates of stress than men. And then last year, there's another study that was released. These folks are from Georgia, or from University of Georgia, I think, or at, I think. But they also, it's a qualitative study where also, as part of discussion groups with women, they specifically asked them, what are your stressors? And they found similarities in terms of like the challenges connected to the children, to raising the children, doing it all. Because one thing that we haven't mentioned yet explicitly is the childcare topic. We know that most farms in the U.S. are family farms, and children have always been around. They are quintessential to the family farm. I mean, they are
Right.
in most cases, if the farm is going to transfer over, it's transferring over because of the children, right? And so we've talked about how essential the children are. They play an active role in farming from an early age, but we haven't really had a lot of discussions around there are times when it is not a good time to have a toddler around. It's just
Right.
like the
Yes.
reality is. And we've talked to women farmers too who said, if I was a nurse at the hospital, I wouldn't be allowed to bring my kid. Why is there this weird expectation that I should have my kid with me when I'm driving this really heavy piece of machinery that's really dangerous, right? And so, and also how much children, as lovely as they can slow things down quite a bit, or they can be counterproductive, right? Shoshana, my colleague, has talked about that was years ago talking with a woman who was planting something, and as she was planting up the row, the kid was coming behind and
Oh
and
gosh.
planting. But yes, childcare. So what we found is, as much as we know that farm families love raising the kids on the farm, when we've asked them about childcare challenges in the last few years, have you experienced any challenges connected to childcare? Maybe cost, availability, you have someone to help you. Before COVID and right around COVID, we were finding 2/3 people were saying yes. And in our latest survey that we did, so after the discussion groups, 3/4 of farm families had said yes, it's a challenge, it's too expensive, it's not available. And it's not necessarily to say that the children would be there all the time, but that, for example, in the summer, when it's harvest season and when it's go, 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 can the kids, it's easier if someone is looking after them. Oftentimes it's grandparents who do that, grandmothers. But the thing is, what was also interesting too in the studies, not everybody has a grandmother, or not everybody has a grandmother or a grandfather who is physically able to do it. They might have jobs. They might be working on the farm, or they might have their own jobs in town. And we've also talked to people who honestly said, I don't want my parents or my in-laws at all involved with raising my kids. Families are great, but sometimes they don't get along. And in some cases too, they talked about how they felt that what they think is safe was very different than what the older generation sees as safe, and they were just not comfortable with whatever grandpa or their parents were doing. And so there's all these things too that are at play that impact mental health too. If you have family relation challenges, if you don't have the childcare that you need, all these things kind of pile up.
It's interesting, you mentioned harvest season being the busy season, and although part of it does overlap with the school year, part of it doesn't. And it's kind of funny that originally, at least in the US, our school year was shaped around the agricultural calendar so that the kids could be home to help with that sort of thing. And now it's kind of the opposite, where it's like, we need the kids out of the way while we're doing this. And these happen to be the months where, they're not in school, they are at home.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's funny how
Well,
that has kind of switched on us.
yeah. Well, and so much of it is dependent on the age of the children. Like that's the
Mm-hmm.
key piece too, right?
Right.
If you have a 14-year-old, they can be out there, and there's a lot that they can do at their level that's safe. I mean, by that point, they're old enough to drive tractors, safely, with enough supervision. But, there is a lot of things that a 14, 15-year-old can do that a 5-year-old cannot do. And so I think it's that challenge too, where, in the summer is if you are in a small school district, most farms are in rural areas. You've had school consolidations. You have school districts that are just smaller that might not have summer school. Sometimes you have summer school or summer programs through the church or other organizations, but there's a cost to it too. That's the thing is, even if the option is available, is it affordable or is it like then it kind of the work that you do is kind of offset by the cost. So
Right.
it's
And not just money cost either, I would assume, because time is a resource as well to have to,
yeah,
schlep the kids back and forth.
yes, the idea of driving came up like constantly in the discussions, and they were like, why would I drive 40 minutes each way to drive my kid to drive the children to an activity that might be 2 hours, or some states have started to have pre-K, like free pre-K during the week. Um, for a few hours a week. But it's really like when you look at it, you're like, that's barely a half day. You drive 40 minutes there. You have to get everyone ready. You drive there. You turn around. I mean, you've lost, unless you have errands to run in town, you've lost your morning. Um, but yeah, so the age of kids too, like came into it. And we had several women talk about how um, when the older children were old enough to drive, that freed them up because I mean there was still the fear of like, oh gosh, now I have a 16-year-old on the road
Right, of course.
with the younger ones. But they did talk about how it freed them up to do other things.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. But of course, I would also imagine that now, as your kids are getting older, you're running into new issues. And I know your study kind of touched on that too. That's not just the younger ones that are causing some stress for these families or for these women. That doesn't change when your kids start to grow into middle school or high school.
You have a big finding of ours. I totally forgot. But you're right. So one of the things that we decided to look at is how does stress varies based on the age of the children. And one of the reasons why I was really interested in doing this is because in the farm safety world, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to is child development, physical, emotional, social, to help think about when are the children ready to do different tasks on the farm. And the idea is children can be engaged on the farm, early, but really paying attention to what they're doing, to what their physical abilities are. So with the younger kids, maybe it's like picking the eggs or helping weed in the garden, that kind of stuff. Whereas when they're older, so what I was really interested in looking at and understanding is the fact that as children become more autonomous and can help more on the farm and are more independent at home, at school, does that mean that the stress is lesser? What we found is actually no. I mean, and we don't quantify it, right? But what we found was stories of when they were youngest, you're focused on their physical needs. Are they fed? Do they have a clean diaper? Are they warm? They're good to go. I mean, they're not that good to go. At some point, they're gonna cry. But it seems like it felt like as much as it's very needy, the youngest kid, they can be very needy. It's easier to meet their needs.
Right. Pretty
As they're
straightforward.
old, right? As they're older, they start talking. They start asking questions. They have
Mm-hmm.
needs that they express a lot more clearly. And so, what women talked about was the complexity of navigating raising children and emotionally being present for them. And also, I think, am I doing this wrong? Am I a bad parent? I think like came up a lot too, right? And so they were talking about how there is the complex, it becomes the stress shifts in the way that they're having to negotiate or navigate trickier conversations with their, children as they grow and as they help them become adults.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. So, how can we be better about supporting these women or these families, whether it's from a community-led effort or maybe a place of policy change? What needs to happen here?
Yeah, I love the way that you're asking the question because there is never just one solution. And a lot of the time it's like it's looking at it in a lot of different ways. So there is at the family level, and this is when it gets tricky because every family has their dynamic and the ways that they work and their assumptions and their priorities, their values. But we did talk to a number of women who felt that they were just not supported at home by their spouses. And they felt that they had to do 3 day in one. And they don't necessarily feel that their spouse had to do the same. Again, these are very, very personal family matters. And it is not to say you should do this, right? But if someone feels that they are in this situation, is can they have a conversation? We've talked to women too who said, my husband didn't realize how much I did until COVID. And that was like 7 or 10 years in their marriage.
Wow.
So there is that aspect too, right? I think there is from the community level is in terms of family and friends, um, can folks help each other looking after the children, being a listening ear? I think my sense is quite a few of these women hadn't really shared these things before. I think there's also the stigma connected to mental health that is still very present. And so I think too is can we have these conversations at the community level around mental health, well-being in a way that's not stigmatizing, in a way that doesn't make feel people like they're weak, but it's just part of life. As part of another study, I have a psychologist who is on the advisory board of the other project. And one of the things that I've heard her talk quite a few times about is we cannot expect to be happy all the time. It's just not the reality. But we also shouldn't feel like we can't talk about our problem for fear that we're going to be seen as this person who is weak and can't figure it out. The reality is sometimes we can figure out problems on our own. Farmers are great. They fix problems all day long. But sometimes we need a helping hand. Folks need a helping hand that's not a judgy one. So there's that. Um, there is in terms of, so if we move up in terms of like who can do something about it, in terms of mental health programs, and it's something that we've heard farm women talk about. So there's been an increased shift on mental health in agriculture, in particular, as there's been more conversations around the high rates of suicide. In other research, what I've done is, because some of my research on mental health, we've looked at what are the resources that are available out there to help farm populations and who do they target. And we found that almost always, either it doesn't say or it targets farm men, because the majority of primary operators are men, and we've heard it too in that study from women who said that they felt that there wasn't really support for them, and also adding salt to injury is they felt that oftentimes they're also the caregiver, and they're the one who's keeping out an eye on the spouse, and when they see they're not doing well, they're the ones who are like, hey, like, do something about this. So they all also felt like they have to be kind of caregiver is not the right one, but the confident to the other person and
Yes.
being the one who reaches out for help when things are really not looking good. And that could be calling, a friend, another farmer down the road and be like, hey, can you talk to Joe here? There is something off. Or however, whatever family friend dynamics are. But it's also having program, in resources available for mental health, it is having resources that specifically are equipped to work with people who experience pre or postpartum depression, something that is uniquely that women can experience. And I would say in our in the follow-up survey that we did, and we asked specifically someone in the household that experienced pre or postpartum depression, and 40% of the respondents said yes. And when I talked to colleagues who work with the general population, they told me, yep, that's about on par with what we see, in other populations. But so yeah, so it's having mental health resources like that speak to those challenges, but it's also in those mental health resources is having information about, hey, do you need childcare? Here are options on how to find it. Do you, it's thinking through like what kind of things do farm families need to go about their day to day and linking people to resources. And then the other piece too, it's about policy. And in the context of the studies, the importance of thinking about policies that support access to childcare in rural areas that is of quality and that is affordable. Um, and in the current farm bill that's been debated, there is, for the first time, there is the addition of support for childcare in rural areas. And that has come for a lot of different reasons. That has come because some of the farm organizations, through their grassroots work, that has come up from at the state level. Young and beginning farmer groups have been saying, this is impacting our ability to run a business. So that has trickled up that way. Our work too has been shared broadly with policymakers. And so I think there was a sense too, or we were, besides the stories that they were hearing on the ground from farmers, they were hearing about, the national survey that we did where we, have all these findings around what does childcare challenges look like? How does that impact the farm business, mental health? And so, who knows if, when there will be a new farm bill and if the text will still be there for childcare, but it's been a bipartisan issue where I haven't heard any farm organizations that has said this is a terrible idea, or the largest organizations are behind it, have added it as part of their policy priorities. I've talked to folks from different commodity groups that have been very much in favor. I've talked to policymakers across the aisle, from folks who maybe 5 years ago would have said absolutely not. And then I will go in their office and I will, talk to them about the findings on childcare, and they will say, we don't know what to do. We hear that it's a problem all the time. We want to do something about it. So I do think there's been a shift in the last, 5 years since COVID. But yeah, so those are like all the different things that could be done. But also one of the things that we've been doing with Shoshanah over the years is really talk about how if we want to support a vibrant farm population, we have to think about, it's really important to think about what the farm needs, but it's equally important to think about what the people need, because without the people, it's hard to have agriculture. As much as new technology we have, as much as, we have autonomous tractors now, we have robot makers now, we still need people at some point or another.
Yep. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that there's some hope that people seem to be coming around to the idea, or are already there, that, we need to be putting some resources towards this. So, what interested you in studying farm families and farm women in particular? What kind of inspired you to go into this?
That's a great question. I think it's one of those things where the personal and work gets connected. Agriculture is baked into the fabric of my family. Along the family tree, we have farmers going back. So I'm originated from France, and I have an aunt who does a lot of genealogy, and she traced back to the French Revolution, all the way there to farming. And the reason why it stops at the French Revolution is because in 1789, a lot of the records, the birth certificates, the marriage records got burned down in the revolution.
Right.
So I grew up, my parents were the first generation to not farm, but we were on my grandparents' farms, both sides, constantly. I mean, to me, like every weekend we were there. Holidays, we spent a lot of time there. I mean, it was a really quick drive. And the number of times when we went to visit dairy barns or the barns of a neighbor, and I remember as a kid being like, again, and they're all the same. When you're a kid, you get bored, right? But as I grew up and became older, it really has been a way through my research to connect to my family history.
Mm-hmm.
And why the focus on women? I've always been interested for some reason or another. It's funny because I started off doing economics. I was going to be a banker. I was going to be the
Okay.
CEO of a bank. Like when I was in high school, that was my job. I don't know why.
Uh,
There was no bankers in the family, but I was going to be a banker. I still cool, I guess.
there's always time.
There's always time. But so I studied economics and ag economics. So I was very much looking at the dollars and cents and what can we do to make sure that farm businesses are successful. But really deep down, what I was always interested about was the people and was how do we ensure that the folks who work on the farm and run businesses, like how do we make sure that they have what they need? And so, a lot of things in life, it's one thing leads to another, working from one mentor to the next. And it's also about, finding ways to really speak to these things, to what really drives us to make a difference in our way. So, a lot of my work at Penn State now is really about it is about agricultural safety and health and well-being, and also being very well aware that all of these are connected. So I look at, safety, health, well-being, and economic viability because all those things are interconnected.
Right, right. Well, I mean, like we said, there's always time to become a bank manager, but I think the work you're doing now is pretty important. So I'm happy
Thank
that
you.
you went down this road.
Also, sometimes I'm like, maybe I should be a baker. I love bread.
I think that way too sometimes. Like maybe I'd be really happy as a florist. That's kind of my like off
Yeah.
in some other universe fantasy job, I guess.
Yeah, when it's been a long day and
Right,
it's
right.
never ending, it's like maybe I should just be a baker, but I'll have to get up really early in the
So it would
morning.
still be a long day.
It would still be a long day,
Yeah.
yes.
So we're kind of going to wrap things up here with the question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, what does it mean to be a woman in ag, in your opinion?
That's a really interesting question. I don't, so the way that we opened the article, actually, the study that we've been talking about, is that women have always played a crucial role in agriculture. As long as there's been agriculture, there's been women and there's been men. Like that's always been that way. But the extent to which we have thought about the particular needs of women, the extent to which we have made room for them to have the same opportunity than men have been very different. I do think there's been a lot of changes recently. And so I think to me is being a woman in agriculture should be able to have a career that is fulfilling along the lines of what drives you every day. I think that that's what this work is about too. It is about supporting women in agriculture in their ability to both be a parent and a professional. Because that's another thing too that we've noticed is there's been, an increase in programs and trainings to involve women in agriculture, which is great. But rarely do they talk about their role as a person. It's the same for men, by the way. Like it's the same for everyone. A lot of the trainings connected to agriculture, even you go to conferences about agriculture, which makes sense, right? It's about a job, right? But rarely do these programs incorporate the reality at home and how the things that are happening at home are directly impacting what you can do at work. And it doesn't matter what your job is. If you have an aging parent that needs care, that needs to be taken to an appointment, that's going to impact your ability to get out in the field and do the planting that you wanted to do, for example. If you have to go pick up the kids at the same time every day, or the bus is dropping them off, it impacts the ability of what you can do. And so I think too, it's really about how can we talk about these things and find ways that works for people, and a lot of times it doesn't necessarily have to cost money. It might involve, like, let's change the schedule a little bit. It might involve at a training, make sure we have childcare to the side so that folks can come. All these kinds of things. And the childcare, by the way, maybe it's the kids from forage.
Great
play
idea.
with the kids. It doesn't always have to be. So, I mean, some things, they do cost money to fix and to address. Like childcare in rural area is a big issue. It's been a huge issue for over 40 years, and it's gotten worse. But other things, like being more open to different ways of doing things and embracing of truly embracing of the family farming, what it means, opening up some of those conversations, which I think this is what this research is about, is having those conversations we haven't necessarily had before or not publicly.
I'm hoping that more people hear about these things, maybe through this podcast, maybe through, publications online, and because I think it's an important conversation that we need to keep having.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining me here. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, of course.
I really enjoyed listening to your conversation with Florence. She is so insightful, and you can tell that she's so passionate about what she's researching and what she's talking about, and getting to talk to all these different women. And it really struck me when she said how it's only been in the past few years that studies have really even started looking at women's mental health on the farm specifically, and not to detract from men's mental health on the farm, because it is true, farmer suicide rates are so much higher than the average profession, and most of those are honestly men. And I think that's a conversation that the ag industry has been having for a little bit longer now, is how do we support farmers in general with their mental health. But it's just fascinating to me that it's been so recent that it was like, well, let's actually also look at the women's stress. And I think that's kind of indicative to health in general, is women haven't always been studied.
No.
Pretty recently, I feel like people were talking about how, seatbelts were designed for men and all this different stuff, where it's like, you haven't actually looked at how women, deal with certain health issues or certain things. So
just how we move through the world.
Yeah.
Really. There's a great book out there called, I think it's called Invisible Women. And it's just a breakdown of all the different ways that health and sociology studies have just kind of ignored the fact that there are women out there.
Hey,
and
we exist too.
Right, and that, our bodies are different than men. The way that we traditionally live our lives is different than men. And so, there's a lot of data out there that has not been uncovered, that is still waited to be tapped.
Like a complete picture of health?
Yeah, a more accurate, more complete picture of how this world actually works.
Yeah, so I think it's so cool that, Florence and her colleagues are really putting in the time to study this. And I also loved how, just based on farming being such a time-consuming job, that their discussion groups, it was it was just based on when people were available, which really got a very broad range of farmers all together that maybe, as she was saying, wouldn't necessarily cross paths otherwise. So I thought that was very interesting to have the entire kind of ag industry of women just, we all happen to be available at noon. Great, we're all together now. I love that.
Yeah, I like that too. And I loved hearing that they got such a positive response when they kind of sent out the call that we want to talk about this. They got so many more responses than they were anticipating. And I think it's just indicative of the fact that women want to talk about this.
Yeah.
We are kind of hungering for a space to talk about this. And I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is shed some light on these issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully all of the women, especially women farmers that are listening to this, hopefully you guys, if you were ever feeling alone in any way of feeling really stressed or feeling like you're dealing with so much or overwhelmed or whatever, hopefully after this episode and after listening to our podcast in general, you feel maybe a little less alone.
Yeah, you're not alone out there.
Yeah.
We're all in it together.
Absolutely.
We should also mention that if you find yourself struggling and you feel you need to talk to someone, the Suicide Prevention and Crisis Hotline is available 24/7. You can call or text 988 to speak with a counselor, or you can go to 988lifeline.org and chat with one there. All right, well, that wraps it up for us. Thank you all for listening. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. If you really like this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any questions or thoughts about this episode or the podcast in general, you can email us at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you again for listening and visiting us here at the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Candace.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2025 by Lancaster Farming newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock and Sophia Kurzius. The music was by Tin Bird Shadow.